Right, so today Clareece and I are going to talk about developing the plain language glossary for statistical methodology research and public-friendly visualisations. So to start with, we just want to acknowledge and thank all the public contributors who are involved in these projects, as well as recognising the Institute of Precision Health at the University of Leicester and the National Institute for Health and Care Research, who have provided either resources or funding for these projects. I will start by talking about a little bit of background, and then I'll talk about the glossary and how we developed that. And then I'll pass over to Clareece, who will talk about the visualisations. So most people probably are aware that in recent years, public and patient involvement and engagement has been increasing, and that's particularly in applied research studies. And statistical methodology research then is about refining and improving the statistical tools that we then use in our applied health research studies. So NIHR and MRC are two big funders in the UK for statistical methodology research, and both those funders have now made PPIE a requirement for their researchers receiving funding. So going forward, that should mean that more statistical methodology research projects have PPI involvement. So we have found that there are some barriers to conducting meaningful PPIE in statistical methodology research. So for researchers, it's often maybe a sort of struggle about communicating the statistics in an accessible way. And for the public, it tends to be around that sort of lack of exposure to sort of statistical methodology and complex statistical terms. It's not the sort of thing they come across in their everyday life. And so suddenly to have all these terms that they've not heard of before can be a little bit daunting. So at the University of Leicester, we have the PPI-SMART group. So we're a group of researchers who are working together to try and improve the incorporation of PPIE in statistical methodology research. And to do that, we are creating resources which will hopefully facilitate that successful PPIE. So some of the resources that have been created to date include an animation about what is statistical methodology research and why PPI input is important. We have some case studies of successful PPI input in previous statistical methodology research projects. We've conducted a survey of current practice, and there's also a document explaining how we can apply EDI principles to statistical methodology research. So then another resource that we would like to add to that list is an accessible plain English glossary of statistical methodology research terms. So we were particularly interested in defining terms that are missing from existing glossaries, and the aim of defining these terms is to facilitate meaningful PPIE in future statistical methodology research projects. Our second project aim was about outlining the process for developing the glossary. So our aim really here is to explain what we've done and why we've done it that way, to be able to, so that other researchers can go on to develop their own glossaries in future that are specific to their statistical methodology research projects, and also to sort of communicate some of our learnings from doing this process in the first place, so that researchers can learn from us and maybe not repeat some of the mistakes we made. So we obviously had PPIE involvement throughout this project, and the aim of that was to gain feedback on the definitions that we've developed in the glossary. So we wanted to make sure that the glossary we produced would be useful going forward for patients and public representatives taking part in statistical methodology projects, and really about aiding their understanding of the research area. So this glossary was developed between July 2023 and August 2024. So we were a small working group of members of the PPI-SMART group, and we're from the Centre for Ethnic Health Research and the Biostatistics Research Group at the University of Leicester. And with the visualisations, we had some involvement from the Institute for Precision Health as well. The glossary development itself involved 2 PPIE groups and involved 4 stages of development. So this slide shows you those 4 stages of development. In blue, they're the sort of the tasks that were being that occurred in each stage, and in orange, they're the people who were working on those different stages. I'm now going to go through these stages in a bit more detail. So the first stage was around identifying the needs and gaps. So we had this idea of developing a glossary, but first of all, we needed to conduct a scoping review to identify what glossaries are currently available. So we asked our colleagues in the biostatistics research group to identify any glossaries that they have used previously. And we also did some Google searches using terms such as plain English glossary or simple statistical definitions to identify any existing glossaries. We did only consider glossaries that have been published in English. This was sort of a resource restraint. And that assessment of whether the glossary that was identified was accessible to the public was made by other PPI-SMART members who had been involved in conducting PPIE previously. So these 2 ways of searching resulted in 5 glossaries. So we've got one from NICE, we've got 2 from the NIHR, we've got a BMJ one, and we found a specific health technology assessment glossary as well. So having identified those 5 glossaries, we went back to our biostatistics research group colleagues and asked them to identify the terms that they felt were missing from the existing glossaries. So these would be terms that would be beneficial to their sort of statistical methodology research projects that didn't currently exist. This resulted in a list of 64 terms for us to define within our glossary. So next followed the initial development of that glossary. So the first draft essentially involved us using ChatGPT and a standard phrase that we used for all 64 terms. So we did split this task across 5 members of the working groups. So we all generated about 12 or 13 definitions each. We allowed ourselves to regenerate the definitions if we weren't happy with them, and we allowed ourselves to combine bits and pieces from the different iterations to produce an overall definition. So what we found was that there were some terms for which we got quite childlike definitions. For example, estimand was described as a treasure map for statisticians that guides them on their data adventure. So we weren't really sure about whether that was maybe appropriate for our public contributors. And we also found that some words lost their statistical meaning. So whilst we wanted to define hazard and censoring in terms of survival analysis, ChatGPT was defining them in terms of their everyday usage. So where necessary, we did remove the age requirement, or we changed that age requirement to ask for plain English instead. So after sort of completing this resulted in a list of 64 definitions for the terms that we'd identified. At this point, we weren't too sure about whether we were pitching the glossary at the right level. So with some of this childlike definitions that had come out. So we decided to meet with the PPIE group first. So our first PPIE meeting had 5 members with a mixture of different characteristics. All of those members had previously assisted or been involved in previous PPI-SMART projects, so they had had some exposure to statistical methodology research. In the meeting, we presented them with definitions for 6 of the terms from our glossary, and we'd sort of generated 3 different levels of complexity. So we'd done the reading age less than 10 years, we'd done a plain English, and then we sort of did what we thought was maybe more suitable for a statistician. And we were basically asking them what their thoughts were on where we should be pitching the level of the glossary. So overall, the feedback from this meeting was really positive. They did validate the need for the plain English glossary, and they also felt that the definitions should be aimed at that reading age of less than 10 years, as some did struggle to understand the plain English definitions. At this point, some of the definitions that had been generated included some examples, but not all of them did. And the PPIE group identified this need that every term in the glossary should have a definition, should have an example to help define it. They also at this point identified that some of the terms in the glossary would be particularly suitable for infographics or visualisations, because that could further sort of elevate those definitions, make and increase maybe accessibility towards neurodiverse people or those with learning difficulties. At this point, we had to say to the PPIE group, we value that feedback, but we don't have the funding to be able to look at developing visualisations, but we will keep it on the back burner. So we then entered sort of stage 3, which was cycles of PPIE feedback and updates. So following that first meeting, we updated all 64 terms in the glossary based on their feedback. So the key change here really was about ensuring that every definition had an example and making sure that every definition was in that sort of reading age of less than 10 years. So each member of the working group updated different terms to the ones that they had initially generated, and then we all had the opportunity to comment on and refine each other's definitions. We then split that list of 64 terms up and sent it back to the first PPIE group. So each PPI, instead of sending them a list of 64 terms, which we thought was a bit long, a bit excessive, they reviewed around 20 terms each, and we split it up so that every definition was reviewed by at least 2 members of the PPIE group. And they then provided us with written feedback at this point, based mostly sort of track changes in words. Some people had just sort of written their feedback into an email. And so then as the working group, we split ourselves into small groups of sort of 2 to 3 people and updated the glossary based on this feedback from the first PPIE group. So now we had sort of a second draft of the glossary. We had another meeting. So this time we had a meeting with a group of PPIE members who had not previously been involved in statistical methodology research. So these members, they had previously been involved in PPIE for applied health research projects, but not the statistical methodology projects. Again, we had 5 members with a mixture of characteristics. And this time we sent the glossary to those members in advance of the meeting and asked them to come to the meeting to provide feedback on the glossary. So we've had 3 sort of key areas of discussion in this meeting. Firstly, the group felt that definitions were too long and needed to be shortened. They identified some terms such as average, accurate or prediction that they thought might be a bit too technical for sort of general audience. And maybe one of the key really important bits really was that they felt that the examples were helpful, but they did not want us to use examples that involved human attributes. They thought they could be stigmatizing, but also really importantly, for any people who haven't maybe experienced that characteristic or event in the example, that could be harder for them to relate to. So, for example, instead of using the height of people, they suggested using the height of plants because they felt that that would be relatable to everyone. So following this meeting, we updated the glossary, we shortened and simplified definitions, we included suitable examples, and as far as possible, we changed the terms that had been highlighted as being too technical. There were some definitions where it was felt, for example, that changing prediction to something like guess would lose that concept of the definition, sort of lose the sort of accuracy we were looking for. So there were a few limitations where we weren't able to change those terms. The glossary then was reviewed and proofread by all members of the working group before it was released. So on this slide, I just wanted to show you an example of how the definition for regression evolved during the development of the glossary. So on the left-hand side, we have the initial definition for the reading age less than 10 years. In the middle, we've updated it following the feedback from the first PPIE group. So that initial definition didn't have an example in it. Following that feedback from the first PPIE group, we've added this example about the height and age of individual people. But then following the second PPIE group, where they asked us to avoid using human attributes and also to shorten the definitions, we've then got this final definition on the right-hand side, where now the example is about use regression involving height and number of leaves on a plant. The glossary was then made publicly available on the Leicester Biomedical Research Centre website. And whilst the development of the glossary was ongoing, we had the opportunity to apply for a small bit of local funding, which we had hoped to use to work on the visualisations. That application was unsuccessful, but as a result of that application, we did get some resources from the Institute for Precision Health, which allowed us to start working on visualisations. So that's what Clareece is going to talk about. But just before that, I want to go through a couple of recommendations we have for anyone who might want to develop their own glossary in the future. Firstly, both the PPIE groups really highlighted this idea of simplicity in the definitions. So we would suggest aiming for this reading age less than 10 years, or there's something else called reading levels as well. So an equivalent reading level would also be appropriate. We'd recommend using examples that are easy for anyone to sort of relate to, so avoiding the use of human attributes, but using those examples to help explain the statistical concepts. And sort of a learning from us, where we started by defining 64 terms in the glossary and then talking to our PPIE group about whether we were pitching them at the right level. We would recommend maybe piloting just a few definitions first of all and talking to your PPIE group to check their suitability before you go on to draft the full glossary. Some conclusions. So our glossary was never meant to be an exhaustive list of statistical methodology terms. It was really about plugging the gap between existing glossaries and the sort of work that's commonly conducted in the biostatistics research group. And as such, the terms in our glossary do cover mostly focus on areas around evidence synthesis, prediction modelling, prognostic modelling, and survival analysis. The glossary, the aim of the glossary is that it's one tool amongst many others that we can use to build and facilitate PPIE. We did find ChatGPT to be a useful starting point, but it did have some limitations. But when we started this process back in 2023, ChatGPT was using GPT version 3.5. When I had a look earlier this week, we're up to GPT 5.5. So it might be that some of the limitations we experience with ChatGPT are less of an issue now in these newer versions. And PPIE involvement in this project did lead to substantial improvements in both the content and the language that was used. We found it useful to have those two different groups with the different experiences. And we did find that we got some different viewpoints from doing so. And we obviously there were some limitations in terms of implementing all the feedback, because ultimately we had to ensure that our definitions didn't lose their statistical meaning. So now I will pass over to Clareece.
Cheers. I can take control now, so we don't need to swap out slides.
Brilliant.
I think I just need you to accept it.
So I will give you control.
There we go. So yeah, thanks Suzanne for that. So as Suzanne said, like we've developed this glossary, but as alluded to, some terms definitely would have benefited for some visualizations. So we got cracking on doing that. So we got some funding to just have a look at 10 terms. We obviously had limited funding. It was done with the same team that Suzanne's described. And yeah, this was done between like April 2024 and September 2025. So there it is. So we had very much the same methodology, so it's very similar diagram of the stages. I think for the visualizations, we had one extra stage, which was this piloting stage, where we did choose the term Bayesian and we piloted a few, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And then the second stage was actually choosing which of the 64 terms to actually then make into visualizations, because it wasn't obvious which ones to choose. And then again, as sort of very similar to the glossary, we then did some initial development, which involved some sketching and chatting to the graphic designer. and then these cycles of PPI feedback and constantly updating to then finally release them into the wild. So that first stage was piloting one visualization. We chose Bayesian because we felt like, so that was chosen by the working group. We felt like it was a term that is often not understood well, and this whole combining sort of past data with new data could work well for visualization. So this is what the infographic designer came up with, 2 different options, and we gave that to one of the PPIE groups. And I think we actually had a complete 50-50 split into what people preferred. I think people preferred the weather analogy. Well, some people preferred the weather analogy, some people preferred the data one. But they did say with the weather, again, there were these connotations put to it saying because the past data is raining, but the new data is sunny, they then were like, does that mean the new data is better? So quite similar with the glossary, the examples, we're encouraged to have more neutral images going on with the future. But they definitely agreed that visualizing this helps understand what Bayesian means and sort of gave us the green light to go ahead and that it was a good idea. So then the next stage was selecting some of the, which 10 definitions we were going to visualize. The way that we did that was, I think, as a working group, we just came together and said which ones we would like. And then we actually emailed the PPIE groups that had worked on the glossary and asked them as well which ones they think would work best to be visualized. And I think we just came together. Some of them were said by both groups. And yeah, we just sort of just chose ones that we thought would work. And so these were the 10 that we worked with. So we got Bayesian, censoring, MCMC, regression, deviance, prognostic model, calibration, discrimination, causal inference, and simulation study. I think calibration and or discrimination were chosen, and because of that we thought we might as well do prognostic model as well, because you sort of need to understand prognostic model to understand what calibration and discrimination are. So we had those 10 terms, so then we went ahead and started doing some initial developments. The first step of this was literally we all came into a room together and just started sketching. We just started drawing. So this is an example of a drawing for the term regression. We thought that was quite an easy one to visualize because we're all quite sort of understand graphs and things, and it's quite easy. The regression is that line that goes through them. And I think it did actually match that glossary definition as well. So we did a bunch of different sketches and then we sent that to the infographic designer, and then she made them actually look nicer, made them look proper. So yeah, this was her interpretation of what we drew on a piece of paper, and she was really leaning in on that plants example as well. So each of those little icons is meant to be a leaf. So that was given to us, and then again for that final initial development, we just as a team sort of just asked for a few little things to improve it. So I think here, we were saying, can you make it more obvious which line is the regression line and actually label it? I think everything else pretty much stayed the same. And so version 2 is essentially our initial development of these 10 terms. And it was these that we then worked with through the cycles of PPIE feedback. So we went through some different feedback cycles. So we didn't necessarily give all 10 to one group and then all 10 to another group. When we came out of our sort of version 2s, that were just from our sketches and the infographic designer, we found that there were still some definitions that were harder to work with. And so some of them had actually multiple versions that we weren't sure which ones to choose, and some we just still weren't sure of it. So we decided we'd send these hard visualizations to PPIE Group 1, which were made up of those that were a bit more experienced in the work that we do with PPI-SMART. And their general feedback was, again, you need to think about sort of the language using, think about some of the examples as well, and again, that neutral imagery. And obviously they helped us choose which ones to actually, if there weren't multiple, they helped us choose which one to then send off for the next feedback. So then once we'd sort of chosen, sort of helped some of the harder ones for PPIE Group 2, we then sent all 10 visualizations to them. We did it in a similar way that we did for the glossary. So we didn't send all 10 of them to everybody. We sent, I think each of them had 4, but it meant that each visualization had 2 people look at them. And we asked the group to look at them beforehand, and then we came as a group together to generally chat over them. And generally, we found the feedback from that was that it was really important to think about people's familiarity with research. For example, exposure to graphs. So with regression, we thought that was a really easy one. We're like, yeah, you just draw a graph, draw a line through it, bish, bash, bosh, done. But actually, so many people didn't understand what a graph was. They didn't understand how the axes work and what that's showing. And so that was really interesting to think about. And then also, obviously, they also highlighted some accessibility needs. So, for instance, red-green color blindness. So a lot of our visualizations relied on your classic traffic light coloring, sort of show red bad, green good. But obviously that isn't always good for people with red-green color blindness. So we came up then with this color scheme, which has been suggested because it still has that sort of diverging color scheme of to bad and good. But it is at least different for people with most types of color blindness, so they should still at least see a difference in the coloring. So to sort of explain more about all the different feedback we got, I thought it'd be good to go over a few examples. So this first one is deviance. So here you can see in version 0, those were our initial sketches. Again, we focused on this graph thing. We thought, yeah, really obvious, really easy, where we drew those lines. Then, yeah, version 1 was from the infographic designer, and then version 2 was our response. So I think we said like, oh, we probably don't need all the key, try to keep things simple. So deviance wasn't sent to the first PPIE group because we thought it was really obvious. We thought we didn't need that feedback. So version 2 is what was sent to the second PPIE group. And I think it was a real eye-opener to how you can be in your own bubble. Because I think this was my favorite piece of feedback, is that somebody said, I've no idea what is going on. All I see is little UFOs. They thought all the leaves were a little UFO and the dotted line was like them beaming down. So that really highlighted that you just, yeah, you got to make things simple. And they also explained like with the axes as well, they didn't understand like what was going on. So you can see in version 4, we scrapped the leaves. We sort of went back to basics. We didn't need, because obviously these would probably be seen with the written examples. So they'd still have the example there, but you don't need that in the visualization. So we scrapped that, made the colouring a bit clearer. We also removed the little ticks along the axis because that confused people. They didn't know what that was about. And we kind of explained how axes work. So the height of the plant, we explained that it's going from small to tall and the number of leaves, few to lots. We also only did one line to show like small deviance and large deviance rather than having lots of them to overwhelm people. And again, we actually added more text because we found even though a visualization is going to help, it's not actually all right on its own. You still need a bit of text to sort of help guide the reader. So yeah, that was a bit of an eye-opener. That was a fun one to do. Simulation study, that was a fun one as well, mostly because when we were coming up with ideas for sketching, we literally couldn't sketch anything. We had no idea what to do. So there was no sketch for that one. So we just gave the written definition to the infographic designer, and she came up with version 1 that you can see here. The definition was to do with, imagine you're traveling to work. Instead of trialing all the different routes, a simulation study would allow you to sort of simulate all those different traffic conditions. So you can see where she was coming from with that. And I think it was a really good first attempt, but we just didn't feel it really showed what a simulation study was. We weren't very good in our feedback, to be honest, but she came up with another version 2A. And again, we were like, oh, it is, yeah, but we still felt like there was something missing. And then one of our team came up with quite a different way of thinking about it. We were actually leaning on the animation that PPI-SMART did about just generally about statistical methodology research, about this whole digging a hole and you need to think about the right tool. So we actually came up with version 2B, which is the whole idea of instead of actually digging a hole with these different tools, you can simulate it to work out which tool would be best, which would be like simulating which statistical model is best. So we gave both versions 2A and 2B to our first PPI group. And yeah, they really liked the dig in the hole and they thought that made a lot more sense. But obviously they had feedback about how to say, like, actually have the inputs going in and then an output, and making it feel a lot more familiar. So that's version 3. And then that was pretty much there. We then sent version 3 onto the next group and they really liked it. I think they just had some small tweaks. I think there was a decorator's trowel in version 3, whereas the others are more gardening plus a spoon. So we changed that to like a hand trowel as well. So yeah, that was simulation study. Prognostic model. So the sketch idea was mine. In my head, I always think about putting people in machines, just chucking them in and they get spat out of some outcome. Unsurprisingly, people don't like the idea of being chucked in a machine and spat out. But the infographic designer, she sort of went a bit more abstract with this, as you can see in version 1. We kind of struggled, I think, to see the same vision for this one. So then version 2A, again, it was the idea that bringing people in, they have read information and then you look at them and then you sort of show what risk it was. But as a working group, we still really felt there was something to this whole machine checking thing. So one of the group, they designed version 2B, but you're on like an escalator rather than chucked into a bowl. And you're sort of like, oh, what is my risk? And you go through into this prognostic model, machine, room, whatever you want to call it, and you come out. And again, we sent version 2A and 2B to the first PPIE group. And yeah, they preferred version 2B. It made a lot more sense. But naturally, they still didn't like the idea of being on an escalator. They felt it was very mechanical. They felt like they were being in a factory and they didn't like that. So the infographic designer came up with the idea of us being on a path, a lot more nice. So the idea is that version 3, you're walking along, you're thinking, what's my risk? You come into this prognostic model room, you get assessed, and then you go on the high risk or the low risk path, which I think was a big improvement. I felt like we were pretty much there now. And so then version 4, it was sort of more small things. The colouring wasn't very readable. So we made sort of the colour choices a lot more easy to read. And another thing that I found interesting is that they struggled with the idea that in version 3, you've got 5 people going in, but only 4 people coming out. And then also, what about medium risk? So it was really key for them to see that it's consistent, that there were 5 people going in and then 5 people coming out, and you've got each of the 3 different options. So yeah, that was interesting. Like my brain wouldn't be bothered about that, but that consistency and having everything make sense was important to them. And then I think this might be my final one. Discrimination was a hard one as well. I don't work in prognostic modelling, so my colleague was actually having to explain it to me when we were doing the sketches. So we came up with this idea that poor discrimination is where you clump together. It's not discriminating all the different people, but good is you have them spread along. So then we ended up with this dial going on, and different colorings. And we went back and forwards a lot with this. It was the same with calibration as well. And yes, I think version 1, we didn't like that in poor discrimination, all the people were different colours, so therefore they were made all the same colour in version 2. We weren't sure of it, but we gave version 2 to the group anyway. And I think they said the dials don't make sense. Like it just needs to, they didn't have any idea what was going on either. So I think we went back to the drawing board for this one and we decided to go back to that line going across. So the idea was the lines and all the people is sort of their true status, their true risk. And then the prognostic model, if it has poor discrimination, it's just chucking everybody in that medium risk box. And if it's good discrimination, then it actually has put them into the different boxes. So I think we were most of the way there then, and then we sent it to version 4, and they still just felt like there was just too much going on, which I think was right, to be honest. So that's how we ended up with just sticking to the boxes, just saying if it's poor discrimination, it chucks everybody in one box. If it's good discrimination, it chucks everybody in their different boxes. But one of the really interesting things about this one, which Suzanne sort of mentioned as well, is the whole language thing. So with discrimination, the group really didn't want us to use that word at all because of the sort of society understanding of discrimination. Even though they have the same root word, it sort of means similar things. The negative connotations with it, they really didn't want us to use that word, but that is the word, that is the word we're trying to define. So we couldn't not use it. So that is why we instead have the phrases cannot separate groups, brackets, no discrimination, and can separate groups, discrimination. Again, similar to deviance, again, adding more words does help people sort of read the visualization and understand what is going on. So yeah, that was a few of the sort of progression of them, but these were the final 10 that you can see here. So you can see Bayesian actually didn't change that much. It just sort of became a little bit more neutral, whether some of them were quite simple. So censoring and MCMC, they matched the definition examples really well. It was really easy to visualize them. But it was still helpful. I think the PPIE group still said that these were useful things to have. So yeah, they were finalised and they were released to the PPI-SMART website where the glossary is also held. So just to finish off with some reflections on the visualizations. I still think it was a really useful piece of work that we did, especially for those definitions that are hard to understand with only words. And like Suzanne said earlier, for accessibility, people that just get information through visuals, it just sort of, yeah, helps expand that. It was great that our two PPIE groups were of mixed characteristics, and we had people whose English wasn't their first language, but we definitely could have been more inclusive, and particularly it would have probably been helpful to go to a group that were completely naive to PPIE or anything like that. That could have been, something, a next stage. As I mentioned, a key reflection was that balance between sort of trying to make the language simple, but still holding on to the scientific needs and like the actual task at hand. That was quite challenging, particularly in the actual focus groups, trying to explain why we still need this word. Oh, I went too many. We believe the visualizations will be impactful, especially because we've shared them online. They're freely available, so anyone can have them, and hopefully we're promoting them through things like this webinar. So yeah, hopefully more people will find out about that and they'll be impactful. And on that line, like we'd love to hear your feedback of how they actually are. So if you are doing any research in these areas and you use them, please do tell us how they went. I think that is the next stage to see how they're being used, and then who knows, maybe we might get some more funding to develop more if they are seen as useful. So yeah, I think that's all from us, so thank you, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thanks both, that was really interesting. I love the tiny UFOs. That will stick with me. So does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? If you want to raise your hand. Oh, I could. Yeah, do you want to mute yourself and go ahead? Oh, we've got lots of questions. Hang on, I need to look at so Johnny, you're first. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. And I was kind of thinking a lot about the discrimination differences, as you were saying, Clareece. And it's a good thing in prognostic models, and it's a bad thing anywhere else. And there were a couple of other examples that I think Suzanne was giving where you also like went against kind of what the PPI group was saying, or you kind of took it on board but didn't go exactly that way. How did that go down with the group, and were they kind of receptive to you not listening to all of the feedback? I mean, there was so much feedback, it was almost like co-production, I think, more than PPI, but did that mean as a result that they kind of accepted that you were making most of the changes, not all, and that was okay?
Yeah, I think the PPI groups we had, they did sort of understand, like when we explained to them, they said, oh, prediction, we don't like that word, it's a bit technical, let's use guess instead. But when we just sort of described and explained to them that actually you can't, guess has maybe a lot of uncertainty around it, but prediction is maybe a bit more specific, so we couldn't really make that change. They did seem okay with that. They did seem to accept that we weren't necessarily going to be able to do everything that they suggested. I think maybe it helps that we did take on the vast majority of their feedback. Like, I mean, 95% of the feedback on like the glossary definitions got taken on board. It was only quite a few small bits that we couldn't. And actually, when it came to the glossary development, the biggest feedback we couldn't do anything about at the time was around the visualisations. But actually, then when sort of opportunities did come up, we were actually able to go ahead and do something with that feedback as well, and go, develop these 10 visualisations.
Yeah, and I think from the visualization side, it took a little while for them to be okay with it, particularly discrimination. We had to try and explain discrimination at the meeting to make them really understand it. And I think in the end they were fine, because we did make a change. We kept the word in there, but we changed how we did it. So instead of saying good discrimination, which to them made no sense, we did the can separate into groups, brackets, discrimination, or whatever. So I think, it was, there's a phrase, but yeah.
A compromise.
That's it, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you. I have a couple of other questions, but I'll let everyone else go first because they may be the same. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Sophie, do you want to go next?
I think language is always a challenge in PPI, isn't it? It's kind of a negotiation sometimes, I think, when you're doing PPI, and it's okay not to fully accept all things if you think that that's statistically or scientifically what you need to do. So I was really struck by the graphics. I love them a lot, and it made me reflect on the work that I've done in my own PPI groups. And I thought, oh, I'm pretty certain I use graphs, and I just put it in front of the group, and no one flagged to me the potential misunderstandings that could be coming from those graphics. So thank you very much for producing them. I'll hopefully be able to use them more in my future work. I'm curious about one of the last comments you said on your slides. It was useful to have a group that was completely naive to PPIE. Could you expand on that a little bit and say why you thought that?
I think for me at least, the visualizations, I think everybody kind of knew what we were doing and they kind of just knew why we were doing it. And I think it would have been useful to also get a group that might be potentially in the future, like first time doing any PPI and might not be aware of it at all. And so it'd be useful to have known, like, if somebody had not done any of it at all and then they were first put in, would these visualizations help? Like, would you be able to start understanding what is going on if you'd literally had no idea about research or anything like that before? I think it's just like another level of previous understanding to just really make sure that these visualizations and the glossary as well are helping.
Yeah, I could see that. I sort of wonder if that would invite new challenges though. If you were to
potentially,
suddenly, because then you then have to explain why you're doing it. And if people don't already have a certain level of understanding as to why you're doing it, why everyone's there, then it makes the interactions much more challenging. And I guess you can always consider that PPI is kind of an iterative relationship. You're always going back and forth and having lots of conversations. So no matter what PPI group you're going to work with, they'll end up having sort of a similar understanding as to why you're doing that research to begin with, if that makes sense. But I do think it's interesting because I think a lot of people sometimes say it'd be good to go to people who've got absolutely no PPI experience. And I think it's interesting to try and dig into why people think that. But yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. And Mandy, do you want to go next?
Hi, sorry, I had some trouble joining, so I missed the start. But did you say these resources, like your visualizations, are available? Where could I find them?
They are on the Leicester BRC website. If we, Clareece, if you go back to the very first slide, I think you've got control at the moment.
I've given it back to you.
Right. Okay. Hang on. Oh, there
so
we
I
go.
work for the Birmingham BRC. I work in prediction modelling. And I'm doing a PhD in maternal health inequalities. So we're quite fortunate to have like a dedicated women's health group. They're involved in a lot of the work that we do. And I think something like this would be really really great. Like we just recently co-produced a 3-minute animation called Understanding Your Baby's Growth, which is now on YouTube. Again, it was like a really iterative process, but I sort of came in towards like the dissemination end of that project. And whilst we explained those terms and that sort of that terminology in the best way that we could to like a lay audience at the start, you know, it's interesting. Nobody sort of in over that sort of course of like 6 or 7 months ever came back to me and went, "Oh, Mandeep, what's discrimination?" And it's sort of making me wonder, like, did they know? Like, did they actually know, or did they not know? And they sort of were maybe didn't know how to sort of ask that question. We were talking about some prediction models that our team had developed, and they were looking at, so we had a few. So one was like complications for women diagnosed with gestational diabetes and pregnancy. We've got one where we were looking at a model that predicts fetal growth restriction during pregnancy. And sort of, you know, just on the topic of discrimination, we sort of described it as, well, the model you know, describes, we were looking at how well it sort of discriminates between women that do go on to have the outcome and versus sort of women that don't, and does that model predict that accurately? But I think that was probably like the depth of that discussion. Sort of people just sort of seem to accept it. But having some sort of, you know, visualizations, a glossary, just up front at the start, I think would be really useful going forward. So I'll definitely jump on and have a look at that. Thank you, and great presentation.
Thank you. I think Laura's posted the link to the glossary page that's got the glossary and the visualizations. I think the web page also has the links to the papers as well, which sort of defines the processes and stuff we went through, if any of that is useful.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much.
Great. I've got a question. I really liked, and it's something that we've seen come up multiple times. So when we were developing the animation, the same thing came up, that as statisticians, we're quite bad at trying to explain things in a kind of lay way. Our initial animation, we put the script together ourselves, and the PPI group that we went to absolutely hated it. We got ripped to bits, rightly so. But then working with people who come with other skills, so like public contributors or people from a more creative background, kind of are able to take what we're saying and translate that into a way that people can understand. So it just makes me think that we as a group need to, and I don't know how this happens, but need to be able to work more with people that come with these other skills, alongside working with public contributors. I just wondered if you had any reflections on that process.
I think in terms of visualizations, it was really helpful having that infographic designer from the Institute of Precision Health, because even though we came up with a few sketches ourselves, yeah, like I said, simulation study, we had no idea how to visualize that. But she came up with that first one just from the definition. And even though we didn't go quite with that initial way of doing it, that then sparked further ideas. So yeah, I definitely think it's always good to branch out to different skills, but it is, yeah, like how do you do it?
Yeah, Johnny.
Yeah, it's kind of following on from that a bit. So I know lots of us at Leicester have done like various infographic trainings and visualization stuff that Nifty Fox and ran and that sort of thing. I'm wondering if like you wanted to introduce like a new definition into this now, how confident you'd feel doing that yourself, and do you think you've learned, because obviously this was a many iterative process as you showed, and I think that was important given how much some of them change from start to finish. Do you think you've learned from that and you wouldn't need as many iterations, or do you think you'd still need to follow that, and would you be able to do any of the kind of designing yourself, or do you think you'd still want to outsource it?
I think in terms of defining, so creating those definitions for the glossary, I would like to think that it wouldn't take as many iterations. I do think we would start from a higher level than we did initially, have a better initial definition. I would still want to run it past a PPIE group before I would put it as a live definition on the website, because that input was really helpful throughout the whole process. But I think we learned a lot about the level of language we were pitching at, about the sort of examples we'd want to include, the length of the definition, that sort of thing. So I think we would have a much better starting point now than we did back in 2023.
Yeah, definitely agree. And from a visualization point of view, I don't know actually if that would change much. I think because we did have those initial sketches, and I think a lot of, I didn't show you the whole suite of initial sketches, but a lot of them stayed the same and were fine. But again, I know that Nifty Fox have said it doesn't matter what practical tools you use, but I think it is also the knowing how to actually make them look nice and knowing the software to do that.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay, well, we're rapidly approaching lunchtime, which my tummy's happy about. So thank you, Clareece and Suzanne. That was a really interesting talk, a lot of things to think about. Please do go out and use the glossary and the infographics, and if you've got any feedback as to how that goes, we'd love to hear it. So thank you for coming, and look for our next seminar, which I think was the 28th of July, but the details will be on the LinkedIn page. So thank you all for joining us. Goodbye.